Hello and welcome back to my channel. In today's video I'm going to be reviewing MaXXXine. I want to start this review by giving my overall thoughts on the career of Ty West up to this point. Prior to the 2022 release of his film X, I believed he was a director who did not fulfill the potential that he had. I had seen the film The Roost, his 2005 directorial debut. I had seen The House of the Devil, which if you want my more detailed analysis of, you can watch my video essay of that I'm going to link right here. We also had his 2011 film The Innkeepers that I saw, as well as his 2013 found footage horror film The Sacrament. I found a lot of his films to be kind of interesting, right? Stylistically, there was a lot of interesting elements. It was clear he had a vision for the type of films he wanted to make. It just didn't seem like he had the budget, the talent, or necessarily the cast and crew around him that could fulfill the vision that he wanted. The Roost was definitely an early film that showed a lot of amateurism, I think, on his part, but he continued to develop, as you saw in The House of the Devil. It was another step forward, there was some really cool sequences, but ultimately I felt the film fell flat. The Innkeepers as well had a lot of the same problems that I had with The House of the Devil. Stylistically interesting, but ultimately shallow films. The House of the Devil and The Innkeepers are interesting stylistically, like I said. They have some pretty cool moments here and there, particularly that gunshot scene in which Greta Gerwig gets her head blown off in The House of the Devil, but they ultimately build to unsatisfying conclusions. Of course, I'm a big proponent of a number of horror films that use style as the substance, particularly the films of Dario Argento or maybe even someone like James Wan. However, I felt that Ty West just didn't have the budget or necessarily the talent yet to fully accomplish his vision, with 2013's The Sacrament being a solid found footage horror film, but that subgenre is so limited in my opinion that unless you're really making something fully transcendent, it's just not going to be that good ultimately. So, from 2013 to 2022, he made one film called In a Valley of Violence. It was a Western. I didn't see that film, so I can't really comment on it. But from that point on, I was still intrigued by him, right? He was still a filmmaker that I was following, even though he hadn't really made a horror film in so long. And after a nearly decade-long absence, he returned in 2022 with X, a film I went to the theaters to see despite the fact that I didn't necessarily like his previous films. And this was because of the promise that I saw in his previous films. There was some really interesting things he was doing stylistically. He just had to put it all together with a larger budget, which he did with X. The film had an excellent cast, a great location, great production design. It had a lot of stuff working for it. Yes, it was still a low-budget horror film, but it was very, very interesting and very well done. I thought it was a very solid film, a good horror film. I was very surprised by it, right? West finally realized his potential in a much stronger way, and I think it was partly due to a very excellent cast that he had. It was clear that the higher budget, the more experienced he got, right? It had been a decade. He had made that Western. He had kind of worked in some other things in television and some other stuff. He had been really kind of developing in a very strong way and was finally able to realize and learn from the mistakes that he had made in previous films. And working with someone like Mia Goth was fully able to transcend himself and his talent into the next level. This was then taken a step further with his prequel to X, Pearl, which followed the 1950s-style Technicolor sort of film after X had been inspired so much by Tobe Hooper and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Eaten Alive, and some other grindhouse and exploitation classics. Pearl necessarily took more inspiration from films like The Wizard of Oz and other Technicolor classics, mixing that in with films like Psycho and moving beyond even the potential that he realized with X. X, I felt, was a very good film, but Pearl was a great film. It was my favorite horror film from 2022, and it really showcased the rising star of Mia Goth. I think this collaboration between the two of them, Mia Goth and Ty West, has elevated both to make them both kind of stars within this genre of horror. Mia Goth has now become sort of a cult favorite, right? She has her own little following, and I think these films are going to have a cult classic status for years to come. This also has shown that Ty West has fully been able to up his game and has really risen expectations for a film like MaXXXine. Having to wait 2 years, MaXXXine has finally been released in 2024. So what are my thoughts on the film? Let's dig into it. The film, of course, stars Mia Goth alongside Elizabeth Debicki, Moses Sumney, Michelle Monaghan, Bobby Cannavale, Halsey, Lily Collins, Giancarlo Esposito, and Kevin Bacon. The film was released on July 5th, 2024 by A24, and up to this point has grossed around $7.8 million worldwide, and has gotten some pretty positive critical reception, though perhaps a bit more of a subdued response than the previous two films, in particular Pearl. Ty West has hinted at a potential sequel. We'll have to see. He says it's dependent on how this film does, though I think it's done pretty well. I don't necessarily know what the budget was and things like that, but based on the sort of results of the previous films that he's made, I think it should do well enough to be able to warrant another film. We'll see. To start with my thoughts on the film, it has to be Mia Goth, of course, that we start with. She's been the star of this trilogy up to this point. Her talent is overwhelming and has been shown in a number of films. I watched her first really in A Cure for Wellness when I went and saw that in the theaters, and I never would have thought from that film that she would have the kind of career she's had up to this point, but it's been so interesting to watch. I loved her performance in Infinity Pool, I loved her performance in Pearl and in X, and I'm looking forward to everything she does from now on. But she gives a pretty good performance in MaXXXine. It's a much more restrained performance, a much more subdued performance, one that allows her to show more of her range than we've seen before. It's not necessarily as much shouting and sort of craziness, but it's more of a grief-stricken character, one that's dealing with survivor's guilt, but is also showing her strength in a lot of scenes, a lot of important moments, right? Where she can really show the growth that she's undertaken, but also the facts that she's really still dealing with a lot of the sort of stuff that her parents put her into, right? A lot of those sort of beliefs that she's developed from her hyper-religious background that have then followed her into this Hollywood, land of secularism and sex and drugs and all this stuff. It's really interesting to see her characterization and her growth within this environment. There's some really cool scenes, of course, that show Mia Goth being Mia Goth, right? I mean, the scene in which she deals with the Buster Keaton impersonator is gold. It's an amazing scene. It's everything perverse and that we love about the films that she's been in, while also showcasing her strength. It was obvious, right, when she was like playing up, oh my gosh, I'm trying to run away. It was obvious what she was doing, and it was wonderful. It was a great payoff for that scene. But there was also some more stuff that I was surprised to see from her, right? There was a lot more of the range, a lot of the more subtle stuff that I was talking about. Scenes in which she's clearly holding stuff back. She's clearly dealing and grappling with the survivor's guilt from the first film, but also with this constant self-determination that she's going to become a star. And there's so much interesting stuff going on, and she does a great job. She really helps carry the film once again. There's a great cast, right? It's undeniable that the cast is stacked in this film. Elizabeth Debicki gives a really interesting and good performance. I think her performance is probably the second best in the film. It really is really interesting and fun. It's a character that I wasn't necessarily expecting to see. I didn't really know much. I saw the trailer, but I don't really remember much going in. So seeing her character was a really interesting surprise and something that I really enjoyed throughout the entire runtime in any scene that she had. It started off kind of weird, like it seemed like she was so kind of distant and weird, but you start to kind of really find her very interesting and a kind of a great counterbalance to a lot of the other characters that are sort of larger than life. She's more of this subdued sort of analytical character that it has a lot of stuff going on underneath the surface that she's dealing with, but she's dealing with it in such a professional manner. We also get a pretty fun performance from Kevin Bacon, though a lot of the scenes with him, I never felt the menace that I think he was supposed to be emitting. I don't know, was he supposed to be menacing, or was he just supposed to be kind of pathetic and sad? The scene in which Mia Goth goes and just beats him up is just wonderful. That's one of my favorite scenes in the whole movie. Though there is some scenes with him that I didn't think were that interesting, right? Some of the scenes in which he's trying to intimidate MaXXXine, I just didn't think they landed well, right? I just didn't find him very much of a menacing or scary character at all, though his death scene is truly remarkable. That is one of the highlights of the whole film as well. So he's in a lot of the great scenes, but he's also in some of the underwhelming scenes. The chase scene through the studio backlots is just underwhelming. There's no real threat, it feels like, to MaXXXine at all in that whole scene. It just feels kind of like a waste of time. There is some cool cinematography and shots, especially once they get to the Psycho house, but it just ultimately doesn't really work for me as well as it could have. Michelle Monaghan and Bobby Cannavale don't necessarily work as well either. I just didn't find them that interesting. I think they were supposed to kind of be comedic relief, but I never really found them to be that funny, though Michelle Monaghan towards the end is kind of funny, right, with her whole pursuit of the killer at the end. It's such a ridiculous sort of larger-than-life character that she plays in that moment. It seems so out of character that's kind of funny, though Bobby Cannavale's character is just, he's not that funny. He's not that interesting. They're trying to make this kind of funny little side character, but I just don't feel like there's enough time with him, maybe, or I don't know what the problem is. The delivery just doesn't land, and I just don't find it that funny, ultimately. Giancarlo Esposito, I thought was great. I thought he was really funny and really interesting, but also could kind of play that intimidating character as well. He was able to both have the kind of weird funniness to him, a kind of offbeat character, while also being scary as well. But scary in a good way because he was on MaXXXine's side, which was pretty cool. I thought Kevin Bacon, like I said, was pretty good. The rest of the cast was pretty solid, right? It was a pretty solid cast. It had a lot of big names, like Halsey and Lily Collins as well. They did a good job. Moses Sumney, I thought, played a pretty fun character. His death scene was really cool. It was kind of more stylistically cool, though, necessarily. It didn't really have impact. Like, I didn't think it was a really effective, like, scary scene or great kill scene. It was more just really cool, and it was obviously an homage to a lot of old-school 80s horror films, which I appreciated. I really appreciated the depth of knowledge that Ty West obviously displays with a lot of his references, and I was picking up on a lot of them. Some of them I didn't pick up on, but a lot of them I did, and sort of like a Marilyn Chambers reference. I just thought that was so cool, and it obviously showcases his love for the genre, which was already apparent in all the previous films that he had made in the genre as well. Now, that being said, I did think that the third act that the film was building to was just unsatisfying again. This was kind of part of a lot of the film's problems that I had, is that there was a lot of moments that seemed to be sort of the old Ty West rearing its ugly head, right? The unsatisfying third act, right? Showing some of West's problems as a writer that he had earlier in his career. He just didn't really know how to end it. You know, it kind of had some interesting ideas, right? But it was so obvious, it was so telegraphed what was going to happen, right? We all knew who the killer was the entire time. I don't know why they were trying to make it some big surprise. It was obvious from the very beginning of the film that it was the father that was back. What he was doing wasn't that interesting either, right? So not only was it not that big of a twist, but also what happened when he finally was revealed wasn't that interesting. Now, kind of being there underneath the Hollywood sign, it was kind of cool, right? There was some cool elements to the film. The detective coming in kind of felt lame. It was just, there wasn't really a lot of interesting stuff going on. There wasn't anything really for Mia Goth to do to elevate her performance. This is when she needs to be at her hysterical best, like what she's really able to accomplish with films like Infinity Pool and X and Pearl, right? Towards the end of those films, she really raises her level to such a high degree of energy. This film, it just wasn't able to raise to that level. It continued with that subdued performance, but in a moment that really needed some elevated, right, some really elevated moments in elevated performance, she just wasn't able to give that because there wasn't the material to do that. And so I found that disappointing. The film keeps Ty West's fetishistic obsession with matching the time period that he's trying to replicate. And it does it very well, not necessarily that I was alive or around in that time period of the 1980s Hollywood, but there's so many little moments that he really tries to nail, but he does it to such a degree that it almost feels like pandering, like he's really trying to showcase, look, they're drinking new Coke, look at all this stuff, look at the McDonald's in the background, look at this, look at that. And it feels like it did in the House of the Devil film, in which he really nails that stuff, but he doesn't nail the stuff that actually makes the film interesting. You can have a great backdrop to the murders, but you have to make those murders interesting and those set pieces interesting. And while some of them are really cool, there's too many of them that are bogged down by just not enough weight, not enough interesting setup or payoff. It just feels like a film that sort of has fallen into some of the trappings that Ty West fell in the early part of his career that it seemed that he evolved out of. Which is not to say that I think the film is bad by any means. I don't think it's as bad as House of the Devil. I still think it's a really fun film. It's a solid film. It has a great soundtrack, a great cast, some really fun scenes, but ultimately it feels a bit hollow, and it feels like it's a step down, right, from X and from Pearl particularly. I think that the trilogy is still pretty solid across the board. I think this film does an okay job of continuing it, but I do find myself a bit disappointed with the end product. Now, tell me your thoughts on MaXXXine. What did you think of it? Are you a big fan of Ty West and Mia Goth? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next week.